I will treat you with respect and dignity. But it doesn't mean you're right. You could still be wrong. And since the world's religions contradict each other, most of the world is wrong about religious truth. If the atheist is right and none of them are correct, which is possible, then still most of the world is wrong. If the Christians are right, then most of the world's wrong. If Hinduism is right, then most of the world is wrong. So most of the world is wrong about religious truth. This is just a logical statement. It's not a critical statement. And so now that changes the whole perspective. Now the perspective is which of these religions might be true, or are they all false? Because those are the only two possibilities. And you know, this is, every religion believes this. This is why a sect of Islam wants to destroy the infidels, right? I mean, that isn't true of most of Islam, but they take their religion seriously. Theirs is the one true religion, so the rest should be wiped out. Right? And that's consistent. It's not consistent with what I think you should do with those who disagree with you, but it's consistent with this truth, that not all religions can be untrue. Either they're all false or one is true. So let's see. An interesting thing about Christianity is it asks you to check it out. Paul wrote in 1 Thessalonians to test everything and hold on to what is good. One thing I like about Christianity is it challenges you to test it. When Thomas did not believe that Jesus had risen from the dead, Jesus went to him and said, here's the evidence. Test it for yourself. It's one of the few religions that says, this is true, and therefore you can test it. You can ask the tough questions and see if it's true. Jesus was asked, what's the greatest commandment of all? And he said, you should love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and strength and mind. He added mind to that. As a physicist who likes to think, I'm glad he added mind. You can love God with your mind. The only way to love God with your mind is to be able to ask tough questions. And so we can test whether Christianity is true. The other thing is Christianity, one of the reasons I think Christianity is true is it's unique. The pastor of my church says that in order to get to heaven, not every religion even has a concept of heaven, but in order to get to heaven, every other world religion other than Christianity has a common theme. That is, you have to do something. The 5 pillars of Islam, or whatever. You have to do something to get to heaven. Christianity is the only world religion that says you can't do anything to get to heaven. It's already been done for you. So where the mantra of every world religion is do, the mantra of Christianity is done. There's a uniqueness right there. That you, in fact, are incapable of doing anything to earn God's favor. So something had to be done for you. And so if you're looking for which world religion is true, there's a distinctive of Christianity that no other world religion offers. And that, again, shows some, at least, uniqueness to Christianity. Let's see. So the next thing I think I say is, you might ask, is there any other objective evidence for Christianity? Last night you gave some scientific objective evidence. And the answer is yes. And the most important piece of objective evidence for Christianity is the resurrection of Jesus. If Jesus said he was going to die and rise from the dead, and then he did rise from the dead, that does a few things. It validates his credibility, and it points to the fact that he's a special person, probably deity. My dad died 20 years ago. I don't expect him to be walking around when I get home. Right? People don't rise from the dead. People in the first century knew you did not rise from the dead. If somebody rose from the dead, actually, then that validates his claims that he's more than just a man. That is the historical event on which Christianity lives and dies. If you want to ask, is Christianity true? You ask, did Christ rise from the dead? And if he did, it's true. And if he didn't, it's false. And Paul says that. He says, if Christ did not rise from the dead, then our faith is in vain, and you're to be pitied more than all men. You're to be pitied because you believe something that has no credibility, and that does no good. Because if Christ did not conquer death, then we're all still going to die without any hope. And that's very clear. So if you want to the cool thing about science and Christianity is there's always another question to ask. Is there another test I can run to check the truth of this? And the test you can run to check the truth of Christianity is whether or not Jesus rose from the dead. Now, I already believe he did. I've looked at the evidence. So let me give you stories of other people. There's a bunch of people who were challenged as atheists or people who are antagonistic toward Christianity. And they were challenged to check the historical evidence about the resurrection of Jesus. And the reason I know their names is because they changed their mind. They went to the study, I was going to say unbiased. They went to the study biased that the resurrection did not happen. They looked at the evidence and they became Christians. Names like Frank Morrison, who wrote a book called Who Moved the Stone. Names like Josh McDowell, who wrote a book called More Than a Carpenter. Names like Lee Strobel, who wrote a book called The Case for the Resurrection. And they were all people who had a predisposed idea that the resurrection could not have happened, looked at the historical evidence, and changed their mind and became Christians. We could talk about that evidence, but it's powerful. One of the reasons I'm a Christian is because if I go to the historical evidence for the resurrection and read the alternative theories, there are a dozen options about what happened that first Easter. None of them can account for all the evidence. They might account for this little piece or this little piece, but there's only one theory that accounts for all the historical evidence that we have about the resurrection, and that theory is that Jesus really rose from the dead. Now, I'm a scientist. It takes a lot to convince me of the veracity of something. My wife gets mad at me all the time because I'm a skeptic about everything. She says, can't you just believe me without asking why? And I do. It's not that I don't believe her, it's that my nature is to always be a skeptic. And I'm a skeptic about the resurrection. I know that people don't rise from the dead. What a foolish idea. And so for me to stand in front of you and say, I think the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus is overwhelming, that you would win in a court of law. The jury would rule that, yeah, the evidence points to a resurrection. That's tremendous objective evidence that Christianity and the Christian God is true. So there's another test you can do. Christianity calls to be tested. So here's the other test you can do. If Jesus rose from the dead, then he's still alive. And if he's alive, then you can actually have a relationship with him. Christians claim that Christianity is not about a list of rules. It's not about what you do and what you don't do. It's about a relationship with God through Jesus Christ. Well, what a stupid thing to say, to have a relationship with somebody who's dead. Right? Once your dog is dead, you don't put the leash on him and drag him around the sidewalk anymore. You know? That would be crazy. You don't have relationships with dead people. But Christians boldly stand up and say, I have a relationship with Christ. Well, that's only possible if he's alive. And that's a test you can do. You can actually personally decide if you can have a relationship with Jesus. I have a friend, he was a student of mine in a class. This was a long time ago, maybe 18, 17 years ago. So, and we've become friends. He went to a talk like what you heard last night on scientific evidence for God. He was an atheist. And he said, there's no good reason to believe in God. And he heard that talk, and it started him on a journey of at least investigating whether God might be real. And he eventually became a Christian. And and we were talking about the nature of evidence. And he said to me, before I was a Christian, that objective evidence for Christianity was so important because it gave me reasons to believe that Christianity might be true. But once I became a Christian, I have a relationship with Jesus. That's much more real than the objective evidence, right? I can tell you all the objective facts about my wife, what she does for a living, how tall she is, when she was born, what she likes to eat. But that is entirely different than having a relationship with my wife. I don't need objective evidence to tell you that my wife is a real live person, right? Because I have a relationship with her. And this happens in Christianity. The times that I really fall back on the objective evidence is when God disappoints me, which he does. He disappoints me. He doesn't always do things like I think he should. Sometimes he seems distant. Sometimes I get mad at him, like any relationship. And at that time, when I'm questioning, I go back to the objective evidence and say, oh yeah, well, the origin of the universe points to God. The resurrection points to God. And it helps me in that relationship. I often use the analogy, it's kind of like a marriage. On those days when you go, what am I doing in this relationship? You know, why am I in this? I go back and I have a piece of paper that says I'm married. I better act like it, you know. Because there's objective evidence that says I'm really married, whether or not I feel like it. And that's how I treat the objective evidence for Christianity now. So I think that's kind of a brief overview of how you start with just some evidence for God from science and eventually converge on Jesus being who he claimed to be, God in flesh who came to make a sacrifice so we could have a relationship with God, the Christian worldview, the Christian idea. So I'd love to entertain questions or comments. Since this is a small group, you can even have comments.
I had a comment that our pastor said, I'm going to the Lincoln Church. He said once that talk about Yuri Gagarin, the first astronaut that went to the space and says there is no God, I cannot see any.
Yeah.
And then he quoted Paul saying, God is we are within him.
Yeah.
And it seems to me also that it's something like inflation.
Well,
maybe not.
I don't know. What Paul is saying is that God is, God can be seen in what he created. And that's what I think. It's not that God is part of the universe, but that God's action can be seen in the universe. I have a friend who says, he's an artist. One of his paintings is hanging in the capital of Oklahoma, the state of Oklahoma. And what he says is when you look at a piece of art, you see the soul of the artist. And I think that's what Paul means. When you look at creation, you see God's soul. You see all around what he's like. And, you know, of course...
but he was saying more in the context that he's outside of the time, you know?
Right. Yeah, I'm not sure. Right. That could be too. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
If you say that there's such compelling evidence for the resurrection, then why are the Jews and Muslims, why would they believe against that?
Well, you know, the first Christians were Jews. And in fact, the message of Christianity was first preached to the Jewish nation. And as a whole, you know, there are many people of Jewish heritage who are Christians. But as a whole, the Jewish nation did not accept that. You know, why people reject the plain evidence of something I can't even begin to speak to. There are people who don't believe the U.S. landed on the moon. There are people who believe aliens landed in Roswell, New Mexico. You can go on the internet and find people who believe just about anything, regardless of what the evidence is. So it's hard for me to try to speculate as to why somebody would or would not believe evidence that's plainly out there. I mean, why would you not believe that we really landed on the moon? There are people who don't believe the Holocaust happened, right? So I think that a careful investigation of the evidence for the resurrection is pretty compelling. But everybody has to weigh evidence in their own way, and you will find people that believe literally anything despite or because of the evidence. I don't know if that answers your question, but I can't answer it for every person, right? All I know is that I can go online and find a lot of people that believe a lot of things with little or no evidence. And vice versa. Lots of evidence for the fact we really landed on the moon and they still don't believe it. Yeah?
Returning to the previous point that we exist in God, there are a couple of quotes like that, right? One is that we, in Him we exist and we have our being, something like that.
Yeah.
And there's another one where it says that the universe is not only created but sustained.
Yeah, Colossians.
Yeah, so, but I mean, currently our scientific theories are that the laws of physics are driving the universe, not that God is actively involved in every single interaction. So how do we...
You know, again, you will get different... So the question is, like, so this is how... Correct me if I'm wrong, but this is how sometimes I phrase the question. Is the universe like a clock that God made work so perfectly that he could walk away from it and keep working? Or does he have to actually somehow sustain it to keep it working? Is that kind of what your question is? And there are Christians who believe both. Even scientists who are Christians who believe both. That God could walk, I mean, God doesn't really walk away, but he could walk away from the universe. It's so well designed and put together, it would keep going. And there are those who take the passage like in Colossians that he sustains the universe a little more literally, so that they say if he was to walk away, even the laws of physics somehow would break down. Right? And I don't think that the Bible is clear either way, and there are Christians who believe both. Me personally, I'm probably more the former. I probably believe that if he's the perfect creator, you know, I can write a computer program and let it run for a while without me sustaining it. And then I have to come in and back and fix the bugs. But if I built it without bugs, I wouldn't have to come back and sustain it, in the sense that I have to continually hold it together. Newton felt the other way. Newton would have been one who says he continually holds it together. And so I don't know the answer. I'm not sure that it's definitive in the Bible. For some people it may matter. For me it doesn't matter which way it works. What I do know is that this universe is pretty remarkably put together. Yeah.
What evidence is there against a cyclical cycle of the universe?
Right. So, I mean, we really don't know what happened before the beginning of this universe, but this universe seemed to have a beginning. And originally, when the evidence for the Big Bang started, when it first came into about, people really hoped that the universe was cyclic, because then you could have it eternal. That began to fall apart when people started to first do thermodynamic calculations. You can calculate the thermodynamic properties of what's called the Big Crunch. If the universe could crunch together, would it then rebound and start again? And based on thermodynamic properties, it was learned pretty early, I think in the 70s, that you could have a couple bounces, but no like eternal oscillations. But the biggest nail in the coffin now is this thing called dark energy. Dark energy, which was discovered about 10 years ago, is this anti-gravity force. We have no idea what it is, but it's causing the universe to actually speed up as it separates. If it's ever going to cycle, it's got to slow down and come back together. But just the opposite is happening. The universe is actually speeding up as it's expanding, which means there's no way that it ever can even come back together. So I have a colleague who is an atheist, and he likes the cyclic idea. And so I was talking to him about this. He says, well, we don't understand dark energy, so maybe in the future, right now it's a repulsive force, maybe in the future it'll change and be an attractive force and pull everything back together. So he's betting on the fact that something that we can measure will actually change its character so that we can still have a cyclic universe. But to me, the dark energy has put a nail in the coffin to any cyclic universe. It's not even going to ever stop and turn back. In fact, just the opposite is going to happen. If the dark energy maintains what it's doing now, the universe is going to, just continue to expand at a faster rate, and therefore it can never collapse. So all I can say is all the observational evidence points to no collapse.
In that sense, there was a guy, Roger Penrose, I think, that resurrected very recently that cyclic universe.
There are ways
about the conformal something.
There are ways that people are trying to resurrect it based on philosophical ideas. But I'm an observational scientist. I will state what I believe on what we have observed, not on what we can speculate. And what we've observed indicates this universe will never oscillate. So again, may it? Yeah. The sign of the dark energy could change. There's always things we don't know. But if you were to base what we